Hello Africa, welcome to Bite Size Democracy, a weekly show focusing on issues around democracy on the African continent. Our show gives you a snapshot of what's happening on the continent in fun, informative bite-sized segments. Please do join us in conversation on our hashtag BSDemocracy, and please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, the African Democratic Institute. My co-host for today is Tinashe. Welcome back, Tinashe.
Thank you for having me back, Otelia.
On this show today, we're going to be looking at the recently concluded 71st UN General Assembly in New York. A few highlights came out. I think a lot of African leaders got an opportunity to address the United Nations, and we're just going to speak about the few that stood out to us. And Tinashe, who would you say stood out to you?
Since the United Nations General Assembly provides a platform for African leaders to obviously air out issues that are affecting the country. For me, it's actually Idris Deby, the president of Chad. He took this platform to air out what's really happening in the African continent. You look at terrorism, that's actually an issue in the West African states. Chad has been quite involved in fighting against Boko Haram, and one of his in his speech, he was actually advocating for the international community to actually help also Chad in regional efforts to fight against Boko Haram. And the other issue was, you raised the issue about the United Nations Security Council representation. This has been an ongoing issue since 2005. African countries obviously needs representation because African states actually form a third of the United Nations membership. But the representation is not there. And you look at how they're saying it's undemocratic, because obviously democracy, it looks at the will of the people, and in this case, it's actually also advocating for the United Security Council. And we look at also President Jacob Zuma. Also, he has been also talking about the representation of the United Nations Security Council.
Absolutely, I agree, because as it is right now, Africa is grappling with issues of terrorism. Look at Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram. I think we have a lot to bring to this table, and we have a lot to learn as well, because the international community, they seem to think that they've been dealing with terrorism more than we have. So I think it's imperative for Africa to get a permanent seat on the USC.
Yeah, and other issues also, you look at the iron of it all, the United Nations Security Council, most of the resolutions they pass are actually affecting Africa. So Africa doesn't have a voice in determining its own future. You look at, they don't have a voice, and when you require the United Nations to actually intervene in Africa.
Exactly. It's really, I think that really is something that needs to be advocated for, and something that needs to be seriously looked at by the United Nations. Who stood out to me was President John Mahama of Ghana, and he spoke about a variety of things. But there's 4 things that he spoke about that stood out to me a lot. That's xenophobia, African migrants, trade, and Ghana as a nation. I'll start with xenophobia. He actually cited how Brexit as an example where xenophobia took over rational thinking. As we are all aware, most of the people who voted to leave the EU were motivated by not wanting immigrants or people who are not like them in their country. And I think that was really a big thing this year, that xenophobia is rearing its ugly head everywhere in the world right now. And the second issue that he addressed was African migrants. He addressed how young people are dying in seas everywhere across the world, especially African immigrants trying to get to Europe for a better life. And he spoke about, this is the 30th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's speech about the Berlin Wall, and I like how he weaved it all in and said, even though that wall was broken down, there's new walls right now that are being built. That young African immigrant who's stuck in Italy in a detention center, who's stuck in France in a detention center, those walls are cutting them off from the world. And I thought that was quite profound, him putting those two together. And then he spoke about trade, and he also made reference to how him as president made sure that Africans don't need visas, get visas on arrival when they get to Ghana, and this helps with trade. This helps with investment and all those kind of things. And he basically was saying, Africa does not need aid. We don't need aid. We need a level playing field where we can trade with everybody, with the rest of the world as a continent. And they also need to see us. You can't see us as one block. There's 54 countries in Africa. There's different cultures, and our level of development or progress is different. So they also need to put all those things into consideration. And then, you spoke about Ghana's democracy, how Ghana, since 1992, they've stuck to their constitution. Presidential terms are adhered they're the shining light right now. They're the example of a perfect democracy in Africa. And then, the last thing that he spoke about that really made me, he spoke about Michael Jackson. He made reference to Michael Jackson and Michael Jackson's song, Heal the World. And, he quoted some of the lyrics and he says he hopes that some of those lyrics can be lifted from paper and be realized in real life. And I found that was a very great speech from President Mahama.
That was actually so profound. In addition to that, he also mentioned about how the international community shouldn't just force democracy upon African states by treating them as a homogeneous group. You look at, his argument was African states are at different levels of democratic development, and he was looking at they shouldn't just intervene. And in his argument, he mentioned what happened in Libya.
Every year after the UNGA, every September, I ask myself, the outcomes and the resolutions, especially the resolutions that come up from the year before, have they been put into practice? Has anything happened? Right now, I'm sure most Africans are not aware that the period of the MDGs is over, and now we are in the SDGs. And as a young African, do you feel like these things trickle down to you personally in your life?
Personally, I would really love to see what they would implement that gives Africa a personal seat, because that would also imply that now they take Africans seriously, because that has actually been the sentiment from many African leaders until they get a permanent seat. That's when obviously I would consider the UNGA actually having a direct impact upon as an African.
Thank you so much, Africa, for watching. Do join us again next week for another exciting show.